So today we'll be talking about the very last of the 3 ways we can evaluate tests. We'll be talking about fairness. And hopefully you will recognize a lot of what we talk about from the textbook today. We can also talk about fairness in the sense of absence of bias or fairness. They kind of mean the same thing. And a definition might be providing all students with an equal opportunity to demonstrate the achievement, to yield scores that are comparably valid from one person or group to another. So some factors we might be considering when we're talking about fairness or absence of bias: race, gender, ethnic background, language background, special needs, family background, etc. And some things to note here is that we want to consider these factors, but also think about the construct that we're measuring. So for example, if I'm measuring English, reading comprehension in English, obviously students whose native language is not English are going to be at a disadvantage in that test. However, since the construct I'm measuring is reading in English, it's still appropriate for me to have them read in English, right? But if my construct was their ability to understand science concepts, it might not be appropriate for me to measure that construct by having them read in English. Does that make sense? Okay, so some key components of fairness. The knowledge of the learning targets of the assessment. So all students should have equal opportunity to know what will be on the test. And how many of you guys have taken a test and afterwards been like, well, if I'd known that was going to be on the test, I would have studied it, right? We want to make sure that everybody knows what will be on the test. They have adequate opportunity to study. So one way I'm modeling that in the class is if you click on any of the quizzes, the celebrations of learning in the test, there should be a list of the topics that will be covered by that assessment. Another component of fairness is the opportunity to learn. So all students should have been given enough time to learn that material. So that comes up particularly if all students weren't given the same amount of time or if they were gone during part of that instructional period. So this happens in elementary school when some students are pulled out of instruction to attend additional, tutoring for specific special needs, or if they're going to a gifted program, they might miss out on some of that learning opportunity. Or if they're in high school, then they're missing time for an athletic competition or to participate in a club activity or extracurricular activity. So we want to make sure that all students are given that opportunity to learn. Another component of that might be that not all students take the same amount of time to learn something. So we also want to consider that if it takes a student longer to learn something, is it fair to assess them in that same time period? Another component of fairness might be, do they have the prerequisite skills and knowledge to perform well on that test? So aside from what you taught them in class, are there other things you're expecting them to be able to know and do in order to perform well on that assessment? So the classic example here is things like math board problems that rely heavily on reading skills. But it could also be things like having a familiarity with the topics in reading comprehension passages, or if I'm asking students to, let's say, give a speech for a presentation. If I haven't taught them how to give a good speech, so that might be an unfair component of that performance assessment. Another component of fairness is avoiding student stereotypes. So, and we might all have these student biases, so things like jocks are poor students, or girls are bad at math, or students from the apartments are discipline problems. That's actually a real life example from when I taught in a upper middle class school. So that if we have these kind of stereotypes about students, or things that we might be kind of haven't even acknowledged to ourselves that we believe about students, we want to make sure that that's not influencing the way in which we assess students. Maybe we need to acknowledge that maybe we have some of these stereotypes and work against them, so it's not biasing us against certain groups of students when we're grading and assessing their work. Another key component of fairness is avoiding bias in assessment tasks and procedures. So we want to avoid any type of test item that might be offensive to a group of people, that might cause them to not do as well on the test. And you think that's pretty easy to avoid, but we see it on the news all the time about an offensive test item or a test question or reading passage to a group of students. So it's probably worth it to have another teacher take a look at your test just to make sure nothing is offensive before you give it to students. So, the portrayal of groups and stereotypical behaviors, particularly like minority groups and low-paying jobs, or thinking about gender stereotypes here as well. Another one is avoiding bias, so unfair penalization. So the content of the exam is more difficult for students without that background knowledge. So that includes, including the types of passages that are we ask students to read about. It's easier to read a passage about things you're familiar with. So if I have a whole passage about life on a farm, it's going to be easier for kids who grew up on a farm than for kids who didn't, right? So thinking about that. So that's particularly important for students who didn't grow up in the United States. So here's an example. Write an essay about recreational sailing. Include in your essay comparisons to bowling, equestrian sports, and racquetball, right? It's going to be a lot more easy for students who are from higher SES backgrounds, right? We want to kind of avoid that type of essay, and it's really easy as maybe someone from an upper middle class background to not really take into account the background of our students, especially if they're coming from a background that's really different from our own. Okay, so here's a question for you. If girls do better on exam than the boys, does that mean that the test is biased? So think about that for a second. So not necessarily, right? That the difference in scores doesn't mean that the test is biased, but it does mean that we should take a closer look at that test. We want to make sure that there isn't bias. It would mean that we should take a closer look at the test items and examine it for sources of potential bias, but it could just be that the girls studied more on this particular exam than the boys, and it wasn't necessarily a bias in the exam itself. So some other ways we can curtail bias in assessments, we can have outside readers, having a colleague read the test, and usually if you read their test and they read your test, we can have some kind of exchange happen there. Analysis of scores, again, not the sole basis, but it can provide some evidence. Cultural differences. So things about the words we use can be different even across the United States. We use different words for different things, so being sensitive to that. Knowledge from the environment, so words that urban and rural and even coastal and inland people know might be different. There's also cultural differences in sharing beliefs, group work, expressing opinions are very different based upon the culture, the types of families we grew up in. So we want to be sensitive to all of those things within our assessments and our tests. Also, cultural norms for respect and politeness can be different. So all of this to say that we should never rely on only one type of assessment to make really important decisions about our students, but we should rely on a variety of different types of assessments. This also kind of leads us to accommodations for students with special needs and English language learners. We want to modify the assessment so that the special need or language background is not a factor in the performance, as long as that doesn't interfere with the construct itself. So we're going back really to these issues of validity. So providing written instructions for a student who is hard of hearing would be an appropriate accommodation if those instructions were only given orally, right? We want to make sure that we're giving access to that curriculum or that assessment in a way that provides them with the opportunity to do that assessment. We'll talk a lot more about students with special needs and English language learners at the end of the course when we talk about assessing students with special populations, but know that it has to do with these ideas of validity and these ideas of fairness in our assessments. Another thing to think about when we're thinking about evaluating tests is practicality and efficiency. So is the information that we're getting from the test worth the resources and the time required to obtain it? So when we're giving an assessment, that's taking away from instructional time, that's taking away from time that kids could be learning. So is it worth that time that it takes to give that assessment? Is the data that we're getting worth it? Is the time, the taxpayers' money that we're spending on paying for that assessment worth the data that we're getting back? So what implications does this have for something like the Florida State assessments? And again, I'm not going to answer this question for you, but it's something for you to consider. Is the time that we spend, weeks, months out of the school year taking the FSAs, the dedication of resources, the computers, the expense that the state spends on developing this test, worth the amount of data that we get from it? Is it really improving our school's instructions? Is it able to inform us about what our students can and can't do? Another thing to think about is teacher familiarity. So does the test help us know more about the student, or is this teacher able to easily give this test? So does the teacher understand the assessment, the procedures, the purposes of the test, and the scoring and interpretations? So the test is only worth it if the teachers can easily give the test, and then if they can use that data to improve their classroom performance. The time required, we should only be gathering as much information as we need. I shouldn't ask 100 questions if 25 questions gives me enough information. And differing time requirements. So if I ask a multiple choice test, it takes less time in class to give that test, but it takes more time to develop it. It takes me more time to write that test. Essay tests are kind of the opposite. It doesn't take quite as long for me to develop a multiple choice test, but it takes a lot longer for students to take it, and it takes a lot longer for me to read all of those essay tests and grade them. And then the complexity of administration. If the test is too complex for students and for teachers to understand how to take it, then I'm not going to get really reliable or really valid results, right? And if we think about that, if they don't understand the directions, then I don't really know if they could have answered it if they had understood the directions, right? And then the ease of scoring. So the scoring should match the purposes. Again, objective scoring is easier to score than subjective. If I'm going to use subjective scoring, I want to have rubrics and scoring guides that are more efficient, so it doesn't take me quite as long to score, and they're more exhaustive than individual evaluations. I also want to make sure that they're easy to interpret. I want to be able to plan how I use that assessment and how I'm going to use those results. So if I'm giving a test, I want to think about, okay, so I'm going to use this test to determine final grades in the class, or if students don't do well on this test, here's how I could use this to help remediate. Or if I'm giving a quiz, this is going to tell me how I can plan my next couple of lessons. So really communicating that with my students as well. How am I going to communicate this to my students so they know how their progress in class is going, and how the parents will also know. So I want to give enough feedback on these assessments to aid in their interpretation as well. When we think about cost, we think about the cost of materials. So if I'm doing performance assessments in my class, that the materials that go along with that for projects can be considerable. So I want to think about, how will my students be paying for this? Do I live in an environment where students will have difficulty obtaining the materials? Or are those materials going to come out of my own pocket, or do I have a budget as a teacher? And then the cost of standardized assessments can be considerable for a state or for a community or for a school. And again, when I'm thinking about those costs, why don't I just go for a cheaper standardized assessment? Well, going for a less expensive assessment is only a relevant consideration if that standardized assessment will also produce scores that are valid and reliable. So going for a less expensive option, if I can't rely on those results, will not result in a bargain for me, right? And if we think about that, when the state picks a vendor for their test, they usually go for the lowest bid, right? So right now we accepted a bid from AIR for the FSAs, and we might question whether or not that bid, if AIR is really able to deliver on their promises, right? Before that we were using Pearson, which I also might question. Are they able to do the things they promised and deliver those really valid and reliable results on those tests? So that's it. Now we've talked about validity, reliability, and fairness on tests. So you should be ready to go. You should have everything that you need in order to write your standardized case study reports and to evaluate standardized tests. And this brings us to the conclusion of our module on standardized testing. So again, if you have any questions about any of this information, please let me know. You can email me and we can set up a time for a phone call or for a tutoring session in my office. I'm available for you to help. Please just let me know, and I'm really looking forward to reading your papers this week. Bye!